March 24th, 1945, U.S. Army Airfield, Ramitelli, Italy. Pilots from America's first all-black fighter group were called to the briefing room. Their mission? Escort B-17 bombers on the first leg of an attack on Berlin. Their direct orders? Protect the bombers at all costs. Halfway through the mission, something went wrong.
We were supposed to be relieved by a white fighter group, and they didn't show up because they had weather problems.
Knowing they'd be pushing their fuel supplies to the limit, the fighter pilots stuck with the bombers and headed to Berlin. As the warplanes approached the target, they suddenly came face to face with the enemy. One of Hitler's secret weapons, the world's first jet fighters.
When they tell you you have the best fighter plane in the sky, and all of a sudden you see a couple of fellas come flying rings around you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's a pretty helpless feeling.
But as the fighter pilots took on Nazi jets in the skies over Berlin, back home on the ground, their brothers in arms were fighting a very different battle by taking on the United States military itself.
Segregation seemed to be the #1 aim of the Army.
When they turned us out of the officers' club, they said, "You have an officers' club. It's right over there. It's a barracks with a ping pong table."
We called it Uncle Tom's Cabin.
We decided to take a stand. It was a matter of pride and a matter of just reaching the end of our rope.
Together, the black aviators in Europe and those in America would wage a two-front war against fascism and racism and help pave the way for a civil rights movement yet to come.
I always wanted to fly. I had to fly. That was my ambition all through my youth. I built model airplanes. I studied about people like Charles Lindbergh, Amelia Earhart, and so forth.
Back in those days, when a plane flew overhead, you went outside and looked at it.
In Detroit, in the 4th and 5th grades, I'd skip school and go to a small airfield about a mile away. If my mother ever caught me, she would have killed me.
I'd been reading about pilots in World War I. They were all brave, they were all handsome, they all wore long white scarves, and I said, this is the kind of combat I wanted to be.
There were no romantic pilots in the air on September 1st, 1939. Just a brutal surprise attack by Hitler's Germany on neighboring Poland. Central to Germany's plan for overwhelming victory was its air force, the Luftwaffe.
Hitler had introduced a new concept of warfare. It was called air power. His Tuskegee bombers had caused that country to surrender for the first time with little or no land army.
Hitler flies to survey what he has done, the destruction of a nation. Poland divided between the Nazi Germans and the Soviets. Good view of what attack from the sky achieved. The flying field pitted with bomb craters.
Days later, Britain and France declared war against Germany. Italy and Japan sided with Hitler. World War II had begun. Far from the conflict, the United States proclaimed neutrality. But with bombs falling in Europe, Americans geared up to fight, Black America included.
I believe it was my duty and responsibility, my father did and my grandfather did, that the country's in trouble. You work with it, you do what you have to do.
You can't turn your back on your own country. So we're as patriotic as anybody else. And so we wanted our chance to prove that we could do something.
But for African Americans, answering the call of duty meant defending a country that saw them as second-class citizens. More than 70 years after the end of slavery, state-sanctioned segregation was rampant. And while life in northern cities was nominally better, racial oppression was a national fact of life. The armed forces were no different. They segregated blacks into separate units, overseen by white officers who assigned the men low-level menial duties. Some branches of the service barred blacks from their ranks altogether.
I wrote the War Department. I wanted to know how one goes about getting into a flying training program. The first letter of rejection I received said in no uncertain terms there were no facilities to train Negroes to fly in any branch of the American military service.
If you became a pilot in the United States Air Force, you automatically became a commissioned officer, which meant that you could give any white non-commissioned officer orders.
For the Air Corps, it was unthinkable for blacks to command whites, let alone fly airplanes. As justification, Air Corps leaders pointed to a 1925 report written by the Army itself.
The document said that Negroes were lazy, they didn't have enough sense, they had no coordination.
And they lacked the intelligence to handle sophisticated type of chores like driving tanks or flying airplanes. And even if they did, they lacked the bravery to successfully engage in combat. This is ludicrous.
This 1925 War College report really reflects the racist atmosphere in the United States in the interwar period. The Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, experienced a resurgence in the 1920s, particularly violent years. It is a very reactionary period.
The 1925 study, The Use of Negro Manpower in War, became really influential, and it's very unfortunate that it did because it remained influential into the late 1930s, early 1940s.
The bombs of Nazi air raiders blasted this French farm, everything ravaged by fire and explosives. Scores of towns are flame-scorched rubble.
Throughout 1940, the Nazi army continued its rampage across Europe. One country after another fell to German attack as Hitler spewed visions of racial superiority and world conquest. With the conflict engulfing Europe, mobilization in the U.S. kicked into high gear. Civil rights leaders demanded that President Franklin Roosevelt create equal opportunities for blacks in the growing war effort.
The Air Corps is something that African Americans really wanted to participate in because to be a pilot was the epitome of skills. You had physical, mental, psychological skills. And if you could do that, it meant you could do anything.
1940 was an election year, and President Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented third term. In a bid to win the black vote, the president promised to create black flying units. Roosevelt handily won the election. African Americans scored a partial victory. They won the right to fly for their country, but only in a single segregated unit.
The sticking point was integration, and there was no way the Army or the military was going to acquiesce to that. It would be an experiment that would be dangerous in wartime, and that was the excuse that they used at the time.
Civil rights leaders sharply denounced the move, but not everyone agreed.
I really didn't care whether it was segregated unit or non-segregated. I wanted to fly. And I would do anything to get the opportunity to fly.
When they said they were opening up the Air Corps for Negroes, I made a rush down to enlist wasn't so much my patriotism. I wasn't that crazy about America then.
You got to understand that different people felt different ways. I knew that the Army was segregated. I knew the whole United States of America was totally segregated, and I didn't like it. But at all times, we were still fighting for equality.
On March 22, 1941, under orders from the White House, the Army reluctantly activated the nation's first black aviation unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. The unit would be made up of just 33 pilots and several hundred ground crew, a tiny fraction of the 30,000 pilots the Army planned to train.
We were the tokens. We had, I believe, enough young blacks with good educations that they could have made 3, 4 fighter groups and 3 or 4 bomber groups. They didn't want us.
Commanding General Hap Arnold of the Army Air Forces is forced kicking and screaming at every step along the way, realizing that he has to do this to satisfy the civilians, but just resisting it because he believes it's bad for his service. The generals refer to it without any irony whatsoever all the way through as the experiment. And I don't think there's any doubt that they all expected the experiment would fail.
Thousands of young, ambitious black men applied for the coveted spots.
In order to get into the cadet training program, black or white, one had to have at least 2 years of college, at a time when I think fewer than 1% of African Americans had a college degree. So this really is the cream of the crop.
We had no doubt that we could do it, and the question was, give us the opportunity.
As the training site for the new squadron, the Army chose Tuskegee, Alabama.
Tuskegee is very isolated. It's in the middle of this very racist state. The town of Tuskegee is divided. The white citizens don't want this operation there because it'll mean more African Americans in Tuskegee.
But the town was also home to a famed black college, the Tuskegee Institute, which was already training civilian pilots. Now the college would train military pilots as well. For many young recruits, the trip to Tuskegee was their first experience with the South.
When you left states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Michigan, Chicago, going south, when you reached Washington, D.C., you had to change trains, and you were giving seats in the segregated coaches.
When we crossed into Virginia, I was notified that I was in a different country, or a different part of the country, and things were different.
When I got to the South, I realized that all those articles I read in the paper were true, because lynchings were common.
Many of us did not leave the base very often. We would travel back and forth between Tuskegee Institute and Tuskegee Army Airfield, but we didn't just get off the bus or do anything. We just went from one point to the other, for the simple reason that it was like no man's land out there.
The hostility of the surrounding community helped forge a tight-knit world within the training program itself.
I call it a little oasis. The campus had its own theater, own drugstore, own recreation. Everything was contained right here. I come to meet my wife when we were students here at Tuskegee.
He was coming up from the athletic field, and that's when I first met him.
She finished college, and she went to work at Tuskegee Airmen Airfield.
And I think he asked if he could walk home with me So maybe that was our first date.
And later, when I received my commission, my wings, I felt that I could ask if she wanted to fly with me for the rest of our life. And she said yes, and that was 65 years ago, and we're still together.
Before the fledgling program got underway, it received an unexpected boost.
Eleanor Roosevelt is, in some respect, a patron saint of African-American pilots. Franklin Roosevelt never really made a decision that I can think of that wasn't always political. Eleanor Roosevelt, I won't say she was his conscience, but if she felt something was right, she would pursue it.
On a visit to Tuskegee, the First Lady met Chief Anderson, the Institute's top flying instructor. "I've always heard that Negroes can't fly," she told him. "I wonder if you'd mind taking me up."
Contact.
The Secret Service agents were horrified. "We can't protect you up there." And she just ignored them. She said, "I want to fly."
Anderson and Roosevelt flew in the Alabama skies for more than an hour. When the two landed, a photographer at the airfield snapped a shot. The First Lady took the photo back to the White House and pressed her husband to support the airmen. She remained a staunch backer from that day forward.
From all parts of the country, these men have come to take the acid test.
For the new recruits arriving in Tuskegee, the hard work began on July 19, 1941, as the Army inducted the first class of 13 aspiring pilots into its ranks. More classes followed through the summer. From reveille at daybreak to taps well after dark, the new cadets trained.
First week, I just sweated. Then we found out who the smart dudes were, and we put them in charge of teaching us.
Those of us who had a better formal education worked with others so that they would get through. So it wasn't a question of, well, we're going to make it and they're going to be held behind. It was to work together.
That was one time I was with a colored group where everybody was for everybody else. I've never seen colored people so united in all my life.
After a few short weeks of ground school, the men began to fly.
Flying itself was so much fun. In the air, there's no black or white or green or whatever. You're a pilot. And that helped to mute some of the racism on the ground because we wanted to fly. That was it. We wanted to fly.
Soon, the men transferred to Tuskegee Army Airfield, just down the road from the Institute.
There, the instructor pilots were all white, and they were all military officers. And some were supportive, and some were not.
The washout rate was better than 50%. The demands were very high by the instructors.
Some people were washed out or failed out because they were not particularly obeisant to some of the white officers, or we were too cocky. I was pretty cocky, but I was pretty good, so therefore I didn't really expect to be washed out.
It was very depressing to see one of your classmates wash out. There wasn't very much offered for Negro students at that time, and an opportunity to fly was, well, a great honor. We really felt it, and when it was denied you, it hit you hard. Well, there was one fella actually went out and crashed after he was notified that he wasn't going to make it.
This whole community of Tuskegee was waiting and watching. It was as if they were a part of the family, and it was a family. Pearl Harbor was really the day that I thought, oh, what now? Life was so uncertain during those days. From that point on, you just took it a day at a time because you really didn't know what your future was going to be.
America was now officially at war, fighting in defense of democracy. A bitter irony for Black Americans.
Your nation calls on you to go out and fight and die for your country, and you can't even sit down in a restaurant and eat a hot dog. It's not a pleasant feeling when you look at it in the long range and you think, what am I giving my life for? What am I volunteering to die for?
In response to a 1942 survey, 20% of Black Americans said they believed life under Hitler would be no worse than the racist conditions they endured at home.
African Americans have served in every war that the American colonies and the United States has fought, bar none.
They served the Union in the Civil War. They rode with the cavalry in the Indian Wars. They fought in the trenches of World War I. From the very first Black soldier, military service had held the promise of equal rights.
The idea was that once they had served their country in war, put their lives on the line, and served that way, it would be harder to discriminate against them afterwards.
But with every war's end, no matter how valiant their service, Blacks had been denied equal rights. Civil rights leaders were determined that World War II would be different. In early 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier, the leading Black newspaper of the day, called for a national campaign to fight for a double victory.
African Americans were actually fighting a war on two fronts. The standard war that everyone else understood, which was for victory over fascism. But the double V, the other prong, meant victory over racism and discrimination at home in the United States.
And we wanted to demand that they give us the benefits and the privileges of first-class citizenship. And we did that because we were looking to the future and hoping that those who came behind us wouldn't have to go through what we went through.
It wasn't a question of, would I support my country that is segregating me? It's my country. I helped to build this country. I was here before most of the people were here. The fact that much of the white population was prejudiced was not our fault. We knew it was going to change. We knew we could help to make it change. And that's why we did it, because it's our country and we need to defend it as well as anybody else.
But someone dead set against a double victory was the newly assigned commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield, Frederick von Kimball.
Colonel Kimball was of the old school, and he believed very firmly in segregation.
When he became base commander, he had colored and white signs put up around the bases.
You couldn't go in the PX together in the lunchroom. You could be separated. You were separated. In the theater, they even had the whites in front and the blacks in the back.
Morale on base began to sink, and word spread through the Black community about von Kimball's repressive command.
If anybody wanted the Tuskegee experiment to fail and was more preoccupied with making certain that segregation was preserved than seeing these cadets succeed, Kimball was that man.
But in the midst of the rising tensions came a moment to celebrate. On March 7th, 1942, members of the first class of cadets defied von Kimball and the odds to receive their silver wings.
It was a real proud moment in your life when you got those wings.
Of the original 13 pilot trainees, only 5 made it to graduation day.
It wasn't until the first 5 received their wings when my class was in the auditorium watching the ceremony that I began to believe, oh, well, they are going to allow some of us to pass.
Friends and family who had worked and sacrificed along with the airmen attended the graduation as well.
They didn't even have a special place for us to sit. We were standing way in the back of that makeshift building. Everything was temporary at that time. George had been writing, if I can manage, somehow, we'll get married in Tuskegee. Immediately following the ceremony, the MC says, folks, wait, don't leave. We have a wedding to perform. So people just stood, and they don't even know who the bride and groom. I had no clue that I would be married that day. No veil, no flowers, just the clothes that I had for the graduation.
The surprise wedding lasted just 10 minutes.
And by the time we said, you know, do you take this? Yes. And I now pronounce you, and George was gone. And because people were saying, oh, congratulate, where's the groom? The graduates had to go get in their flight suits and take off and demonstrate their abilities of flying and all. So I'm left at the altar, so to speak. It was very romantic.
More graduations and weddings would follow. Soon, enough cadets had earned their wings to bring the 99th to its full strength of 33 pilots. With the squadron complete, the Army Air Forces tapped one of the first graduates to command the unit, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr.
When Colonel Davis said, stop, you stopped. You didn't ask why. When he said stay, you stayed. You didn't ask why.
When you reported to Lieutenant Colonel Davis, you better have your game face on, which meant you were dead serious and ready to operate.
He was a very stern taskmaster, but he respected intelligence. He respected leadership.
Davis's father was a career military man who had risen through the ranks of a segregated army to become America's first black general. Following his father into the service, Davis had enrolled at West Point in 1932. As the only African American at the academy, he suffered relentless harassment.
Nobody spoke to him at the academy, only on official business. He said the most dreaded days of the week were Saturdays and Sundays, because those were open seating in the mess. And he'd come in, get his food, go to the table where the cadets were sitting and say, Cadet Davis requests permission to sit. The senior cadet would look up at him and say, permission denied. And he'd have to move to the next table and the next table, and finally end up in the back of the mess hall, eating by himself. He didn't have a roommate those 4 years.
But in 1936, when Davis graduated, he was number 35 in a class of 276. When the training program at Tuskegee was started, Davis joined the very first class.
He had a quality of character that none of us could compete with. And that was pure tenacity, willpower, determination.
Most of us consider Ben Davis Jr. a minor god.
In September 1942, with Davis in command, The squadron was declared ready for combat. The men were put on full alert. And then the waiting began.
The problem was no commander from Burma to England wanted the all-black fighter squadron. They were convinced that no white enlisted person would take an order from a black officer.
As the men waited to be deployed, tensions with the surrounding white community festered.
I'd been to a party one night, and a white officer stopped, "Where you niggers going?" And I told him, "We're not niggers, we're officers in the United States Army Air Corps." The guy ran back to my gun, he cocked his gun, he put it to my temple and said, "Nigger, you say one more word and I'll blow your goddamn brains out." That was the way they did things then down south.
You keep finding that the great majority of officers in the Air Corps hierarchy really would like to scuttle this whole operation and to have it fail. But there are enlightened individuals, white officers at every point, that would like for this experiment to succeed and are instrumental in helping it to succeed.
One such individual took command at Tuskegee in early 1943. The Army replaced Frederick Von Kimball with a young colonel from the South, Noel Parrish.
Truthfully, in some of our minds, he was dead before he arrived. He did get us all together and tell us that he was a new commander and that he would be fair with us. And that word was very important. And I have to admit that the man kept his word to the T.
He seemed to stand up for the black people and to do what he could to make the base acceptable and livable.
Parrish took down the colored and white signs on base, socialized with the men, and lobbied for the Tuskegee program in Washington. He also invited black celebrities and entertainers to the base. Heavyweight champ Joe Louis was one guest. Singer Lena Horne another.
Now, Lena Horne, when she came, that was a blast. We had a dance, and she insisted on dancing with every cadet. Now, she didn't do it more than 2 turns, but that's, and we called her our pinup.
As Parrish improved conditions on base, civil rights leaders in Washington demanded that the men get a real combat assignment.
There were debates going on at the highest levels of the Air Corps with, again, Mrs. Roosevelt and others from outside the Air Corps pushing to make sure that they're given meaningful assignments so that they can prove themselves.
The media kept calling for them to send our boys overseas because we had the right to shed our blood like everybody else. Of course, I wasn't interested in shedding my blood, but I mean, but nevertheless, that's the kind of stuff we were getting on the media.
America had been at war for more than a year. The U.S. and its allies, Britain and the Soviet Union, were attacking German-held positions from all sides. On April 1st, 1943, after a 6-month wait, the men of the 99th got the word and started packing.
When they got their orders to go, the whole town, not the downtown, the Tuskegee Institute part, went out to the base, and it was like a celebration. It was a farewell party, and the whole base took part in it.
There were parties all over the place. I was beginning to feel sorry for myself. The other guys had wives or sweethearts, and one of my squadron members introduced me to this young lady. She was a nurse. So I said, would you mind spending the rest of the evening until we leave? I'd appreciate it. And after having known each other for about an hour and a half, she said to me, I think I could spend the rest of my life with you. Oof. Oh, boy. I said, where have you been all my life? And about 30 minutes after that, we got a PA notice. I said, well, that's it, I gotta go now. Will you write to me? She says, you know, I will.
We were glad that they were finally going to get an opportunity to prove themselves, but there were as many tears as there were smiles of joy.
The men left Tuskegee the next day, bound for North Africa. Perhaps in combat overseas, Benjamin Davis wrote, we would have more freedom and respect than we had experienced at home.
10 months from our activation, we arrived at Casablanca, North Africa, was assigned to the Desert Air Force, started our combat orientation and indoctrination.
The first enemy the men encountered wasn't the Germans. It was their new commanding officer, Colonel William Spike Momeyer.
Spike is a perfect name for Momeyer because he had a reputation for being one of the most obnoxious Air Force commanders ever met.
Momeyer did not want blacks in his Air Force.
We were never made a part of the group at all. He simply treated us as redhead stepchildren.
The airmen's assignment under Momeyer? Drive the Germans out of Pantalaria, a strategic stepping stone to the Italian peninsula. Sorties against the heavily fortified island began with ground strafing missions.
That's the worst mission a fighter jock could have, was strafing.
You've got what the Germans call flak, but anti-aircraft weapons bearing in on you as you're coming down to make these strafing attacks, and you're going to get shot.
You're going at a stationary target, but there's stationary gunners out there. They're not moving. And they can just sit there and track you across the horizon.
The planes the men had to fly made the job all the more difficult.
That P-40, it had so many faults. Speed, it didn't have much of, about 200, 250 miles an hour. And it just didn't have the power.
The P-40 was obsolete by World War II, in particular in the European theater, the Mediterranean theater, but that's what you had. And so somebody had to fly them, and they invariably got hand-me-downs, which made it even worse.
But the 99th held its own. One morning, from a dusty airfield, the men climbed into the cockpits of their P-40s and headed out over the Mediterranean.
All of a sudden, I saw traces going by my wing, and I turned out, oh my God, there was a guy right on my tail. He was firing at me. So I knew I was in trouble. After firing a few machine gun bullets at me, then he started firing his cannon, and I could see puff, 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 bang! It hit my left wing. The airplane shuddered. It didn't go down, but I knew I'd been hit. And so I prayed. I said, Lord, help me, I'm in trouble. And sure enough, I saw one of the P-40 peel out of the formation, came around behind the German, behind me, and started firing his gun. The German broke off his attack. So it was a sort of a moral victory. I had survived my first baptism of fire.
In just 2 weeks, air power alone brought Pantalaria to its knees. Back home, friends and family eagerly awaited news.
At a supporting airfield,
I was out there at the movies, and the newsreel came on, and guess who I saw? I saw him.
men of the 99th have a brilliant record.
I was just I couldn't believe it. It was the members of the 99th, and they were all walking around like real people on the screen. And I jumped up and went out and had hysterics. I just couldn't stand it. I was so devastated. It was so real.
Veterans of 236 missions.
Up until then, it was just reading letters. But to see the men actually in action was just almost more than I could take.
The 99th United States Fighter Squadron is composed entirely of Negro pilots.
Bowing to determined steady pressure from civil rights leaders, the Army activated 3 more fighter squadrons. And in a major breakthrough, an all-black bomber group.
Initially, the Air Force had shied away from having African-American airmen fly bombers because it would mean a much greater investment. As opposed to having one fighter pilot, you would need a bomber crew. That might be 8, 10 men. You need ground crews to work on twin-engine planes.
After training at Tuskegee, the new bomber and fighter squadrons transferred to Selfridge Field, Michigan, just outside Detroit. These airmen faced a home front battle they hadn't trained for. By then, several war-hardened veterans such as Charles Dryden had returned to serve as combat instructors.
There was as much segregation in Selfridge as there was in Tuskegee. Different was, in Tuskegee, you knew what to expect. You didn't expect that in places like Detroit, California, New York, and Chicago, but it was there.
At that particular base, it had a magnificent officers club, great theater, great sports area. Well, when we got to Selfridge, we were told that we were not to use those facilities, and that we were, no matter whether we were pilots in the Air Corps, we were still second-class citizens.
Lord have mercy. But these pilots knew the discrimination violated official Army regulations that said all officers could use base clubs. The regulation made no mention of race. Backed by the letter of the law, the airmen made a bold, calculated move.
So we went to the club, tried to integrate the officers' club, which was lily white, fully segregated. And I said that there's an Army regulation that says officers assigned to a base are obligated to support that club with their presence, their dues, and their participation. That's the club, we're officers, that's the regulation, here I am.
They were really very angry, and you do see this with the men, men like Charles Dryden, who came back because they felt, I've flown 50 missions over Germany, I've fought the enemy, and I'm not going to take this kind of treatment.
The Air Force's response? Transfer the squadrons to bases across the South. Once there, the men found a situation they never could have imagined. Enemy prisoners of war had been captured in huge numbers, some 300,000 in the North African campaign alone. Many of them were transported to military stockades in the United States. The black airmen ended up at some of these same bases.
Actually, the prisoners of war were used to work around the bases, and they were also allowed to go to town, which was unheard of. And they could move freely around the post. They did wear a P on their back, prisoner, but they could go anywhere they want.
We saw German prisoners of war who could do things that we couldn't do. They could sit anywhere in the base theater. We had to sit in the segregated color section. They could go in the PX cafeteria and have a meal. We couldn't even go in the building. I became furious. I just couldn't understand
Allied forces under the supreme command of General Eisenhower was preceded by very heavy aerial bombardment.
A month after the Allied invasion of Sicily, Spike Momeyer, still indignant about black men serving in the air forces, sent a memo up the chain of command that threatened the existence of the Black Fighter Squadron.
He never wanted to have African Americans under his command. He didn't think they could succeed, and this was the easiest way to get rid of them.
Colonel Momeyer writes this memorandum calling them cowards, calling them incapable of leadership, saying that they are not up to the performance that his men were demonstrating, the other squadrons, his white officers, and saying basically that he thought the experiment was failing. This is a damning report.
As the report rose through the officer corps, ranking generals stamped their approval and added comments of their own. The Negro type has not the proper reflexes to make a first-class fighter pilot. They lack aggressiveness and the will to win. Time magazine got wind of the report and publicized the criticism in an article titled, "Experiment Proved?"
And so Davis suddenly finds himself called to Washington to defend the performance of the 99th Squadron against Momeyer's accusations.
In a masterful press conference, Davis challenged the allegations head-on.
The pilots of my squadron were eager to meet the German and really fight it out. One of my pilots was shot down by flak in the Mediterranean and forced to sit
He does point out that his men are actually flying more missions than their white counterparts because there are fewer of them, that they have performed the missions adequately. They have shot down German fighters even in these inadequate P-40s.
We provided air support for ground troops by dive bombing. We strafed strong points, holding up their advance.
And then he says, my P-40 squadron is performing equal to or better than any other P-40 squadron in the Mediterranean. And that becomes the key.
The War Department took the bait and called for an investigation into the combat performance of the Black Squadron. Hard statistics, not prejudice, would determine the fate of the unit. Far from the mounting drama in Washington, the 99th was focused on fighting Nazis. The Germans had retreated to the mountains of central Italy, gaining a significant defensive advantage. The Allies came up with a new plan. Reinvade just below Rome at the coastal city of Anzio and cut across the peninsula, strangling enemy troops to the south.
The 99th, luckily, was given the mission of protecting this invasion fleet there at Anzio. And the 99th came eyeball to eyeball in air-to-air combat with the German Luftwaffe.
The 99th pushed themselves and their outdated P-40s to the limit. After 2 days of ferocious dogfights, newspapers back home cheered their astounding victories.
It proved that if you take any group and you give them training and an opportunity to exercise that training, they will do extraordinary things.
The Anzio invasion began to restore the 99th's reputation. Time magazine changed its tune and trumpeted the squadron's success, saying, "Its victories stamped the final seal of combat excellence on one of the most controversial outfits in the Army." Final vindication came from the War Department itself. At the end of March, The Pentagon released its report on the performance of the all-black squadron. It concluded there was no significant difference in combat efficiency between the 99th and other all-white aerial units.
By the grace of God, this congressional committee that had been appointed said, leave the 99th be.
We were overjoyed when they said that they would remain in combat, even though there were those of us who wanted them to come home.
The 99th had won the chance to prove its worth. By spring of 1944, the 3 additional black fighter squadrons had arrived in Italy. They joined forces with the 99th to become the 332nd Fighter Group and relocated to Ramitelli on the Adriatic coast of Italy. Ramitelli, like Tuskegee, became a world of its own.
At Ramitelli, we lived in tents, one after another, in what we called tent row. We had a mess hall, and we had a place where we just hang out. It was a community.
We were segregated. We had segregated bases. We didn't visit the white officers' bases, and so I never saw too many, had in contact with many white officers or anything.
Now, in terms of the Italian population, we were on an old farm, and there were people around who were farmers. And there were some children around, and we would usually adopt 1 or 2 kids to come in and bring us some eggs and to do our laundry. And I have to say that there was no prejudice in that sense. The only prejudice might have occurred where white soldiers said that blacks had tails or something like that. But the Italian people were Americans.
By early summer, the Allies had liberated Rome. In the north, they landed on the beaches of Normandy in the D-Day invasion. The tides of war had turned. Allied long-range bombers were flying into enemy territory in full force.
Bombers are trying to just bomb the Germans into submission to make it impossible to continue to wage the war by destroying their industrial might.
B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers lumbered through the skies, raining destruction on strategic sites below. But their size and slow speed made them easy targets for enemy guns.
And every time an enemy fighter shoots down a bomber, it shoots down 10, 11, 12 men.
In February 1944 alone, the Allies had lost 114 bombers and more than 1,000 crewmen. Allied fighters were supposed to accompany the giant warplanes to protect them from German attack. But some fighter pilots were more interested in racking up kills than babysitting bombers.
Now, a lot of guys, they would jump Germans and chase them and shot them down. Well, if you move in between 330 and 430 miles an hour, 5 minutes of flying puts you, what, 20 to 30 miles away, right? You're away from the bombers. You're not providing the protection.
General Ira Aker, Allied Air Force commander in the Mediterranean, had a plan. He asked Benjamin Davis if his men were ready to escort long-range bombers into the German heartland, an assignment vitally important to the war. Davis jumped at the chance.
Increasingly heavy blows in the Allied cause are now being struck by the various American air forces in all theaters of war.
As the pilots took off from Ramitelli, They knew the stakes were high.
Once we were there, we knew what we had to do, given the circumstances in which we came into the war. If we had lost bombers, we would probably be pulled out of the sky.
Davis instructed his men in no uncertain terms.
His rule was that he didn't care if anyone ever became an ace, but that if you left the bombers so that they could be hacked up by enemy fighters, that you would answer to him.
Basically, the bombers would be here, we'd be above the bombers, and we would be weaving in groups of 4 planes across the bombers to provide sort of a net against the German planes coming down.
I guess I was like all the rest of these characters. I wanted to be an ace. I wanted to shoot down some Germans so when I got home, I could tell my girlfriend that, yeah, I was an ace. We'd sit there over those bombers at 25 or 30,000 feet, and somebody would say, bogeys at 9 o'clock. You look out at 9 o'clock, 15, 20, 30 miles away, you see little black specks. You knew they were German fighters. Normally, some fighter groups would say, tally ho, but not with Colonel Davis.
Along with the new high-profile assignment came a spectacular new airplane. The most advanced tactical fighter in the war, the P-51 Mustang.
Well, I think it felt like going from a Model 8 Ford to a jet. It was a real transition, a real fine one.
My check out in the P-51, that was half scary and half joyous. Once I got the bird in the air, hey, I was in hog heaven, you know, because it was a nice flying bird.
Flight speeds of 440 miles an hour, excellent high altitude performance. It's the ideal plane. Even a hand-me-down P-51 is a better plane than anything you have ever had. You've got the plane to match up now and go the distance.
All fighter groups had distinct markings on their planes. Candy stripes for one unit, a checkerboard tail for another. The Black Airmen would be no different.
We started our escort missions, and I'd say after about 50 or so, we said, well, we'd better get a real name and identification so that we would be sure the bombers and the Germans would know when we were on a mission. And it was decided jointly that we would paint the tails of all those 51, 72 of them, red. And we changed our call sign to Red Tail, and we became known as the Red Tails.
Through the fall of 1944, the Red Tails escorted bombers day in and day out as they hammered away at the enemy. The bomber groups were stationed at their own bases across Italy and would take off in advance of their fighter escorts.
We usually took off exactly at 7 o'clock in the morning, and the colonel would pull out on the runway and we'd pull out behind the plane that we were to fly next to. And about 30 seconds before 7, you could see his engines revving up and down the runway he'd go, and then we had to follow in 30-second intervals.
We could hear the bombers going over. They'd be going over while we were still down there on the ground, getting together. We could see the formations.
We would take off, one group going one way, one group going the other way, at different times, of course, making a big circle, and eventually find 16 planes here, 16 planes here, 16 planes here, headed out to meet the bombers. A beautiful, beautiful thing, a really logistical miracle in a sense that we could make this big circle and come around with all of our groups ready to go out in combat.
As soon as we crossed the Alps, the anti-aircraft stuff was popping in the air. I said, what am I doing here? I want to go home.
As the bombers pushed deeper into enemy territory, the escort missions became increasingly dangerous.
We were nervous, and any fighter jock that said he wasn't nervous is lying to you. I thought I was bulletproof, changed in a hurry. Fear beats the hell out of you from time to time.
I remember many a mission that I've been on it. All of those targets were heavily guarded. They had all kinds of flak guns down there, and we could see all this flak coming up, you know.
They'd fired from the ground, and when the shell explodes, it throws all these pieces out. That's what tore airplanes apart. The B-17 formation was never turned back in the history of World War II once they're on a bomb run. No matter how many fighters, no matter how much flak, we were trained and trained well for one reason, and that was to fly that airplane straight and level on a bomb run and drop our bombs.
And there were quite a few missions that we escorted crippled planes back. We'd stay with them until they got out of enemy territory or enemy aircraft that attacked them. So if they would, at least they wouldn't get shot down, we'd stay with them as long as we could.
One time I came home with 2 engines gone and 2 of them leaking oil, and it was a dangerous business, there's no question about it.
Always short of pilots. A tour of duty for a white fighter pilot was 50 missions. A tour of duty for the black pilot wound up being as many as 70 missions, 40% more than our white counterparts had to fly. And the black pilots were flying 4, 5, 6 days straight before we could get a day off.
So Davis, one of the other ones, say, you know, if you leave, we're in trouble. We're short. Will you stay? And we'd always say yes. And so the missions went on and on and on.
All of these guys were playing Russian roulette. The life expectancy of a fighter pilot was probably 15 to 20 missions.
Keep in mind that we're talking about guys who were 19 like myself. The old dudes were 23, you know. They had just passed teenage and just gotten there. And to accept and live with these losses was something they had to grow into.
I used to call it the lonely night. You come back home, you've flown with a guy all day, and I saw 2 of them get killed. There's an empty bed over there, and you don't rest well that night. But then you get up the next day, and they say, okay, you're on a mission, you do it.
I don't really recall us having any special ceremonies or anything, but you had to keep going. You come in the next morning at 5 o'clock maybe, they'd call your name saying you're on that mission, so you get up and you go out and you fly, and you don't have time to think about it too much.
But those back home could think of little else as they awaited word from their loved ones.
As I tell young people, no cell phones, no computers. In some areas, no phones for guys who came out of rural areas, not even a telephone, you know. So you waited for the snail mail. And that was slow as all get out because it was wartime, you know, so you just waited.
And when I'd get a letter from him, many times I'd be at work and my mother would be at home. I lived at home while he was gone. And my mother would call and say, "You've got a letter." We were all excited, couldn't wait to open it. And I couldn't wait till I got home. And I'd say, "Well, read it to me, Mama." So she would open the letter and I could feel her blushing over the phone. Some of it was quite graphic, I think. And he was so upset when he found out I was letting her read his letters to me. But I couldn't wait till I got home to read them.
The Red Tails began to develop a first-rate reputation among the bomber groups. Some fighter pilots named their planes after wives and girlfriends. Colonel Davis named his by request, because white bomber crews requested the Red Tails so often.
The fact is they wanted the Red Tails. They felt comfortable because they could see the Red Tails above them, whereas in some of the other fighter groups, they would leave them. And that is because of the discipline that Ben Davis instilled in us, that your job is to escort the bombers, stay with them.
We couldn't do anything about the flak. We couldn't do anything about impossible weather. But when they got their 51s and were told to stay with the bombers regardless, good chance I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for that fighter protection.
On September 10th, 1944, a year after the War Department had almost pulled the Black Airmen from combat, top brass from the Army Air Forces visited Ramitelli to personally decorate 4 of the group's pilots. In spite of the honors and the escort requests, many white bombers had no idea the Red Tail pilots were black.
They didn't know Ramitelli existed. It wasn't on their maps. In a couple of cases, they had to make emergency landings there, saw the Red Tails, said, "Oh, great, we're at the Red Tails base. We've got it made now." And only after they saw the African Americans running around, maintaining the planes, getting the planes ready for their missions, those sorts of things, that they even realized there were black people doing this in the Air Force.
In December, one American bomber group force landed at Ramitelli.
There were a couple who were from the South who were really prejudiced, and they said they're not going to sleep with any niggas. So they went to go sleep in their plane. And it was cold, and it was aluminum, and it gets even colder. So finally, about 2 o'clock in the morning, these guys knocked on the door, said, "Can we come in?" And they stayed with us for about 3 or 4 days, and we had some good conversations. But after they left, one of our officers who was censoring the mail came across this letter written to one of the officers' wives, said, "I spent the last 3 days eating nigger food, sleeping with niggers, and I am sorry, and I hope you will take me back." That gave us some indication of how deep the racism was among some. But I have to say, in fairness, the majority of those who were there did interact with us as individuals, as human beings.
By the start of 1945, the Allies had beaten back a daring Nazi offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. Now they prepared to deliver the final crushing blows. Army Command assigned the Red Tails to their longest mission yet. They would cover the first leg of a bomber raid on the Daimler-Benz tank factory just outside Berlin.
Normally our missions would be 1,000 miles round trip. This was going to be 1,500 miles round trip. So when the P-51s would take off on these combat missions, they would have wing tanks. They have supplemental tanks so that you have more gasoline in order to accomplish those longer missions. And when you got into combat, you would drop those wing tanks and so that you could have more maneuverability of the planes.
The Red Tails ground crew worked round the clock to attach the needed tanks to the P-51s. Mission day arrived March 24th, 1945. As always, Davis issued stern orders to his men.
General Davis told him, said, look, we're going on this mission, and don't you ever leave one of these bombers. If I catch you leaving a bomber, he said, don't land on this base, you land somewhere else.
It was an especially dangerous mission because of all the flak, the anti-aircraft defenses around Berlin, but also the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, would be there protecting Berlin.
At the halfway point, the unexpected happened.
The group that was supposed to relieve us as they went over the target got lost and failed to show up.
With strict orders to stay with the bombers, the airmen set their sights for Berlin, knowing their fuel supplies could run dangerously low. As the Red Tails and the bombers neared the target, they suddenly encountered the enemy.
Out of the side of my eye, it was called 9 o'clock, I saw these streaks coming. Now, these streaks were the German jets.
The planes were Messerschmitt 262s, the world's first jet fighters.
ME-262 has a speed that is actually 100 miles in excess of what a Mustang can achieve. The jet is working against you with 430-millimeter cannon, and those are big shells. If one of them hits you in the wrong spot, your plane is going to disintegrate.
I knew what they were. They were coming in to attack the bombers. I said, drop your tanks, follow me.
The Red Tail pilots had just one advantage over the Nazi jets: maneuverability.
Instead of going this way, I went down, turned the plane upside down, went down under the bombers, and then made a hard right turn, and I caught one of the jets just as he was coming in to shoot down the B-17. I hit him broad stream, boom, he blew up. Bailed out.
The Red Tails downed 2 more of Hitler's ferocious jets. The bombers hammered the target.
I looked at my fuel gauge and it was below half because I'd used a lot of fuel in the combat. So I really didn't have enough fuel to get back to Ramitelli. So the alternate site was in the event it's called Rimini. I said, I'm coming in. I called it. I came in and landed. And when I pulled it in, the engine clunked out because I had run out of gas.
The Berlin mission earned the Red Tails a Distinguished Unit Citation for outstanding performance of duty.
The citation recognized not only our work in combat, but our work in the ground crew and getting those tanks there, getting the planes ready to go.
Back in the U.S., the home front battles were heating up. The all-black bomber group, the 477th, would lead the fight. The Army, reacting to escalating racial tension, had shuttled them from base to base for months. In March 1945, they landed at Freeman Field, Indiana, where General Frank Hunter and Colonel Robert Selway were in command.
Hunter and Selway, there's no way to put it. They were racists, they were white supremacists. They resented having to have African Americans around them and did their best to get them out of the Air Force.
Selway did everything he could to enforce segregation and circumvent Army regulations that stated that all officers could use base clubs.
He designated the officers' club on the base as for instructors only, and he created a second officers' club for trainees only. And he also classified every white person on the base as an instructor and every black person on the base as a trainee. It's a very transparent effort to segregate the officers' club.
The men of the 477th refused to use the trainee club.
We wouldn't go there. We wouldn't eat there. We wouldn't do anything. You couldn't go to the PXs. You couldn't go to the show.
We just knew that it was something that we couldn't stomach any longer. It was the final act.
So we decided that we would look for a time, and then we would go and we'd make a test of it.
In a carefully orchestrated act of civil disobedience, the Black Airmen set out to integrate the White Officers Club.
So we had them all dressed in first-class uniforms, and we sent them 3 at a time to the Officers Club.
I was maybe the second or third group of 3s, and we sat at the bar, tried to order a drink, but the bartender says, "I can't serve you." And we said, "Why not?" We're ordered not to serve you. That's enough in the Army. When somebody orders you, you have to comply unless it's very unreasonable. And so we left. Other groups of 3 came along, and the very same thing happened to them.
So we went down there, and they had this officer outside. He said, "You can't go in." He said, "You got to be a member of the field." I said, "Well, I'm a member of the field." Said, "In truth, that no niggas can come in." Well, that made me mad.
Barred from entering and fed up by the treatment, Roger Terry and 2 other officers pushed their way into the club. Desperate to regain control, Selway, with Hunter's backing, drafted a new base order designed to reinforce segregation at Freeman Field. Selway then ordered the airmen to sign the document, saying they fully understood and tacitly approved the policies.
And that was the last straw. Because in other words, yeah, you resent the hell out of this. You're being treated as an inferior, and they want you to okay it. It's like ramming it down your throat.
We were determined that we would not cooperate in any such arrangement.
101 men said, "We're not signing that." That's all there is to it. You can do anything you want.
When we disobeyed those orders, of course, it was disobedience of a direct order, which was punishable up to including death under the Articles of War. It didn't enter our minds about, what the consequences might be.
The 101 men were arrested. 3 were also accused of using force when they entered the club.
It dawned on me, hell, I took on the Army. And I took it on at my own risk. And I'd do it again.
It's a tremendous public relations nightmare for the War Department. It's obvious that Selway has been trying to get around War Department regulations that prohibit racial segregation in recreational facilities on Army bases. And the black press is pushing this. Mrs. Roosevelt is all over the War Department. The NAACP is asking for updates almost every day on what's happened to these officers.
So what do we got? We had a standoff.
But events on the national stage suddenly overshadowed the mounting crisis at Freeman Field. As the nation mourned President Roosevelt's death, the Army quietly moved the Freeman Field protesters from the base.
On a very bad day, they had some transport planes come in, and they put 101 of us, I was not one of those 101, on these planes and took them to Godman Field, Kentucky, which was on Fort Knox, and put them in a stockade. In other words, a group of barracks that were surrounded by barbed wire fences that were at least 14 feet high. And they were imprisoned.
An area was cordoned off, and floodlights were put up all around there with armed guards. And of course, we could, even from our quarters, see the German soldiers, prisoners of war, had much more freedom than we did.
They wanted to court-martial all 101 of them for disobeying orders. But the problem is the orders violated the basic Army's code of conduct where if you were an officer, you went to the officers' club. It didn't say anything about black and white. They hadn't put that in the code.
Days later, aware of the explosive situation, Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall intervened. He ordered that all except the 3 accused of jostling be released, but it was not without penalty.
We were given reprimands, which is made a part of our records in lieu of court-martial. And that's about the second punishment to court-martialing.
For the 3 still under arrest, a court-martial trial was held.
If there was any fairness about it, there wouldn't have been a trial.
2 of the 3 were acquitted. Roger Terry was convicted.
Terry was put out of the service, and it turns out that his charges in the service were synonymous to felony charges in civilian life, which meant that he couldn't vote, he couldn't do things that felony people were prohibited from doing also.
You'd be surprised what it does to your mind. You become morose. You're quick to take offense. It took a long time before I got around to being congenial.
The all-black bomber group would never get to fight the enemy overseas. On May 8, 1945, 3 weeks after the Freeman Field mutiny, Germany surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to an end. All told, America's first black fighter pilots had flown more than 1,500 missions, shooting down a total of 112 enemy aircraft. Of the 450 black pilots that served, 66 had been killed in the line of duty. Over the summer, their fellow airmen began returning home.
Coming into New York Harbor with the flags waving and everybody exhilarating, Statue of Liberty.
Down the gangplank we go. There's a soldier that has a sign, white troops this way, colored troops this way.
Back home, back to reality. Segregation, discrimination, everything else that went along with it.
And over with the white troops, there was a whole bunch of press and bands and so on. Over with the colored troops, the black troops, there was one reporter and a small band. And I said to myself, welcome back to the good old USA.
The double victory had yet to be won. But the war and the men who served and sacrificed had laid the groundwork for change.
The civil rights groups, the Black Press and the NAACP and the others come out of the war pushing for full inclusion, full desegregation of the armed forces.
And there are enough white servicemen, and I think this is something people often underestimate, there are a number of white servicemen who come out of that war having fought alongside of black soldiers who thought, these guys have fought, they fought well. This doesn't make any sense.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry or religion or race or color.
In July 1948, 3 years after the war's end, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, officially banning segregation in the United States military. Within a year, the Red Tails were inactivated. The men reassigned to other racially integrated units.
It was a joyful day in one sense. And on the other sense, it was a sad day because we had been together as a unit since 1942. Suddenly you realize we're going to be divided and go to the four corners of the Air Force. And it's going to be different, it's going to be harsh.
I moved forward with the attitude that this is going to be progress. And over the years, it proved just that.
The U.S. Air Force, which had become a separate branch of the military in 1947, was one of the first national institutions to integrate. Benjamin Davis rose through the ranks to become its first black general.
The military set the pace, I would say, because civilian segregation was rampant, and the idea of the military integrated, and I think that the civilian population began after that to integrate more so than it had in the past.
In many respects, the civil rights movement grows really right out of World War II and the World War II experience.
In 1995, 50 years after the close of World War II, the Air Force cleared the service records of Roger Terry and others who took a stand at Freeman Field.
Government pardon, and all my rights and privileges were reinstated, and I got excited, and it was one of the great moments in my life. It was a good feeling to be vindicated, because that showed that we're a country of laws, and that sooner or later you can be vindicated if you're right.
It was a time in history that we should be very proud of. It's a time of history where we helped to change the world. And I think we set the star very, very high for anybody who's following us.
I have observed, looking at the history of nations going all the way back to Egypt, through Greece and Rome, Italy, France, Germany, Britain, Japan, China. I have never seen or read about a country that whose people has shown an ability to change like we do.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
We helped black people raise their heads and say, I can do it. I can go anywhere I want to go. And I remember a pilot friend of mine saying, America's not perfect, but I'll hold her hand until she gets well.